Our next two guests are worked and have worked in entirely nonpartisan capacities, but in a very high-level way. When we first started organizing this program, we wanted to not only examine the role of women in elective politics, but also those who support and carry out the important business of government at the highest and some of the most consequential levels. And I call these folks guardians of our democracy, which led us to these two women sitting here before you today. Amy Cohen is Executive Director of the National Association of State Election Directors. I've gotten that wrong in the past, and I apologize. The nonpartisan group was formed to share information across its national membership to support the election infrastructure, which is so important, and decentralized in our country. Yet in striking testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee in 2022, Amy said, quote, physical security of the association's membership had become a top priority, as officials have been increasingly targeted with threats and harassment, which continues today. Before stepping down last year, Linda Limon was one of the longest-serving chief election administrators in the country, having led American election systems for 25 years, surviving COVID, and not surprisingly, a partisan bid to oust her. With perhaps the most consequential election in our lifetimes looming, Amy and Linda are here to discuss the challenges facing poll workers and election directors, many of them women, whose nonpartisan work has been thrust in the maelstrom of partisan politics. Please welcome them both.
Thank you, Kevin. Hope lunch was good. Yeah, good. Yeah, I think 26 years was my pleasure in working in it's okay. And I was counsel to the Maryland State Board of Elections before that, so it means I'm old. Sorry. Elections are complicated. There are a lot of moving parts. You've got voter registration, you have to find the polling places, you have to design the ballots, you have to print the ballots, you have to test your voting equipment, you have to train all these poll workers, hundreds of them. You have absentee balloting or in-mail ballot. It's called early voting, election day voting. You have to count the ballots, you have to certify the election, and all of us now are subject to various kinds of audits. When they're done before or after certification is always sort of controversial. I'm going to brag a little bit. Maryland is sort of the model for the nonpartisan structure of elections. I was appointed by the governor, but my agency was completely independent of the governor's office. And although I depended upon him and the General Assembly for the budget, they never cut it because it was always their election coming up. And so it was very easy to maintain the funds that I needed. All of the local election directors in each of the counties in Baltimore, 23 counties in Baltimore City, are appointed by a bipartisan board. Right now it's 3 Democrats and 2 Republicans on the state and the local boards of elections. There's no politics allowed. Me and my staff never made any contributions to anybody. We didn't put up lawn signs. We didn't have anything to do with the political side of the job. And that is generally what is practiced at the local level as well. It made it a little easier because you never had to write a check, but it also kept us away from all of the nonsense that's going on in some of the other states. However, there's lots of public scrutiny of what we do. Anything that went wrong was my fault. So, to give you an example, a tree fell across a road blocking a polling place in one of our counties, and a reporter called me up and asked me what I was going to do about it. And I kind of took a deep breath and thought, I don't own a chainsaw. So I said, well, let me look into it. But that's the kind of things that I would get from some of the reporters and the politicians. Linda, what are you going to do about it? The big snafu was in the 20,000 COVID primary, where we were all set to have our normal election with absentee ballots, or mail-in ballots as they're called now, early voting, and election day in-person voting. Early voting in person and election day. And of course, with everything being shut down, we had to switch to an all-mail ballot for just under 4 million voters. Educate the voters and educate the politicians. Well, the printer that I had contracted with to print the ballots, the contract contemplated a 4 to 5% of 4 million ballots that they had to print, because that's what our expected usage would be for the absentees. And they couldn't perform when everything changed, and they were not very forthright about it, I must say. And the ballots were late, and the politicians reacted not very positively. And one of our senior politicians in the state of Maryland, at a very public meeting, called for my resignation because the ballots were late and everybody was chomping at the bit about it. I didn't resign, obviously, and the following general election went very smoothly, and he apologized at a public meeting and sent me some Maryland brewed beer. Unlike a lot of other jurisdictions, there have been only one real effort in Maryland to inject politics into my office, and that was in the 2002 election. A rare thing happened in Maryland. The voters elected a Republican governor. And he immediately, even before he was sworn in, sent someone to tell me that I had to leave. And I said to them very frankly, with you guys, I said no, and if you try to fire me, I will sue you. They tried to fire me, and I sued, and I won. So his effort failed, but it was a painful experience. I remember after the judge ruled in my favor, back then there were hordes of reporters in the courthouse, and my assistant said to them, "Follow us back to the office." And they all did, and when we walked in, my entire staff is standing in the conference room crying and clapping, and I went, that was well worth it. That was really well worth it. So that's the big partisan effort, unlike some of the other jurisdictions, Michigan, Wisconsin, where the person in my job is constantly under attack, which is really a shame. As I said at the beginning, elections are complicated and have a lot of moving parts. I highly recommend something that came out, I think just this week or maybe the end of last week, from the elections group. It's a media guide written by Pam Fessler. Some of you may have heard of Pam. She was with NPR covering politics for probably 25 years. And she's going to be having a webinar on April the 25th at noon. If you have any inkling that you're going to be covering elections, I recommend you look at the media guide and try to sit in on that webinar. It's bound to be very, very informative. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Amy, and then we'll take any questions that you all may have.
Well, thank you very much for having me. And I just want to say, you guys have no idea how exciting it is for me to be on a panel with Linda. I've been in elections for 12 years. I've never gotten to see Linda on a panel, let alone be on a panel with Linda. So this is basically why I said yes. Not that I'm very excited, not excited to talk to you, but I was so excited about this.
I delegate well.
So I'm the executive director of the National Association of State Election Directors. And in 40 states, the Secretary of State or Lieutenant Governor serves as the state's chief election official. And in those states, my member typically, though not all, and we'll talk more about why, because yay, federalism, but typically my member does work for the chief election official. And then in the other 10 states, DC, and the 5 U.S. territories, my member is the chief election official. And as Linda talked about, that's typically the states that have boards or commissions. So Maryland, Puerto Rico, others, DC, Virginia, New York. There's not really any sort of geographic rhyme or reason. So across the board, though, none of my members are elected. They are all the sort of public servants whose responsibility is to implement policies, implement technologies, work with local election officials, and really sort of focus on the brass tacks. I like to tell people that like we're the nerds behind the scenes who are, you know, making a lot of the magic happen. And I'm also very fortunate, you know, none of my members are elected, so that is nice for me because you all know in working with elected officials it is a little bit more challenging sometimes. So I am always very grateful to get to work with people who are public servants and they're for that reason. We are an information sharing association, so we don't take positions on issues, and we primarily exist to facilitate information sharing across our membership. And so a great example is that Arizona was the first state to have online voter registration. I think that was 2002. And now we're at, I think, 40-something states. And that's not with any federal legislation. That's because the states were talking to each other and we're like, hey, this is really pretty efficient. And so we do that, we facilitate that sort of peer-to-peer information sharing. And we really get in the weeds on stuff that, you know, people from the outside may not realize. One of the issues we talked about a lot in 2020, for example, was when you were on unemployment, if you served as a poll worker, would your the money you make as a poll worker, would that impact your taxes or your eligibility to receive unemployment, right? Those are the kinds of like really nitty-gritty issues that we focus on. And you know, Linda talked a lot about how elections are complicated. They're also exceptionally decentralized. So while every state or territory has a chief state election official, the vast majority of sort of the elections work that most people are familiar with is happening at the local level. And there are between 8,000 and 10,000 local election jurisdictions in the country, depending on how you're counting, with New England administers elections at the municipal level, so they don't have any county government. I'm from Connecticut, and I didn't know that was weird until I went to college. And then Michigan and Wisconsin administer elections and have government at both the municipal level and the county level. And so Wisconsin is actually a pretty notable example for a whole lot of reasons, but they have over 1,850 municipalities and then another 72, I think, counties. And so all told, they have over 1,900 local election jurisdictions, which if you're good at math, which I'm not, but if you're good at math, that's about 20% of the local election jurisdictions in the country. And so we're talking about, you know, big cities or, you know, big cities like, you know, Madison and Milwaukee, but we're also talking about, you know, hamlets and villages of, you know, 25 registered voters. That's a lot of disparity. And we see that sort of nationwide, where even the states that administer elections at the county level, there is, you know, there are some counties that are really big, and then there are some counties that have, you know, 2,000 or 3,000 voters. And it is one of the challenges, I think, when election officials are being asked for their opinions or perspectives on potential policies, is that you can't just think about the big jurisdictions. You have to think about your smallest jurisdiction for everything. I'll go back to Wisconsin again because they also, based on how they're structured, on an annual basis, about a third of their members turnover, or a third of their local election officials turnover every year. And about a third of those people also work part-time. And so that is a lot when you're thinking about how do we make sure that all of our local election officials are, you know, singing from the same handbook, right? How do you make sure that everyone is implementing policy, implementing law the same way? It's important to remember that in most places, local election officials don't work for states, and also in most places, states cannot tell local election officials what to do. You can't make mandates. There are a couple of states where you can. And also, states are not the legal counsel for local election officials either. So sometimes when questions come up, you know, a state can say, well, our reading of the law is X. Like, please consult with your attorney. But also, if you're in a jurisdiction of 25 registered voters, do you have a municipal attorney that you can get in touch with? These are the kinds of things that we have to be thinking about. And I know sort of the focus of this event is, women in this role. And it, for a long time, elections were sort of perceived as very, very administrative, very paper-based. And so it was some of the classic, perception of, filing and administrative work. And so it was seen as an easier way for women to get into particularly local government. And we still, I think, see a lot of women at the local level because of that sort of history. Certainly since the designation of elections as critical infrastructure in January 2017, a lot of our world has changed. And we've gone from, election officials as sort of record keepers to election officials as IT managers. And then since 2016, we're also cybersecurity experts. And now we're also communication professionals. And so the job has sort of grown exponentially, really pretty quickly. The sort of last thing I'll say on sort of the threats and harassment piece, I'm speaking to a bunch of women in media, so I don't think that any of you are particularly unfamiliar with what it's like to be a woman on the internet. It's not always wonderful, and certainly we do see that in our fields, and we do see I think, some threats and vitriol directed at women that is probably different than it would be if it were directed at a man. But we also see a lot of vitriol is also directed at men. It's just different. We've been fortunate in a lot of ways that we haven't seen a lot that is sort of very obviously going after someone specifically because they are a woman, but I, feel confident that it does, occasionally happen. And certainly, as I said, we see, some language and things that is used that is certainly not what would be directed at a similarly situated man. So my last piece of advice, I think Linda's recommendation about the elections group guide is a really good one. I'll put in a couple more plugs. First, I would say, please make sure that you reach out to your state election office or your territorial election office. You might not like what you hear. I get it. You might not get responses that you think are as fulsome as they should be, but it makes a difference to be getting the information about elections from the source. One of the things we are sort of most concerned about for this year and over the last several years is the proliferation of false information about elections. And it means that it is even more important for accurate, reliable information about elections to be coming from election officials. And you guys play a huge role in that because really nobody knows who their chief election official is. No one knows who their local election official is. But when you are putting them in media, you're giving them a platform and you're helping get that message out. So to that end, also please engage with your local election officials. The thing about election officials is that, I'm lucky because I work with a bunch of nerds, but universally we are a bunch of nerds, right? Everybody is going to want to talk to you. We just want to talk about the nerd stuff and we really want to roll up our sleeves. So problematically, you actually might be like, this is not at all what I wanted to talk about, but you're going to learn a lot. When you reach out to an election office and especially a local election office. And a lot of what local election officials do specifically is open to the public. So voting equipment testing, other things like that, certification, audits, all of that is open to the public and gives the public an opportunity to sort of see what's going on, and also that we're not hiding anything because election officials care deeply about transparency. And then the last thing I'll say is, one of the biggest parts of my job is engaging with the press and the media, and either pointing you in the right direction to making a connection to an election office, or helping put some of what people are hearing in context with either the sort of national context, or this is actually how voting system certification works and things like that. So please don't be shy about reaching out. Our website is just our email domain, since you all have that. It's nased.org. And we also have an FAQ document that tries to cover some of the higher level questions that I know I get at the national level all the time, and then point you to more resources, either at the national level or direct you directly to your state election offices. So I guess I'll pause there, and we can go however you want to go, Kevin.
Sure. I'll just open with a quick question. You both probably have seen this new report. Oh, I need to get. I thought I was. I'm on. I think.
No idea.
The Bipartisan Policy Center was out with a new report just within the last week or two, I think, talking about their concern about turnover with election workers, and whether it be because of the volatile climate and or folks who are just aging out of this business. It sounds like, and I don't mean to direct that at Lyndon.
Tell us how you really feel.
You can take a swing at me later. But they identified that as a big concern as we move into this election season. I wondered how your members see it, and how, Linda, you've seen it on the ground in Maryland.
So election officials don't think about time the same way that normal people think about time. So after first of all, there are elections happening every Tuesday, but I know most people only pay attention in even years. And so at the end of every even year, if you get a bunch of election officials around the bar, what they're going to say is, I don't know if I have another presidential in me, but I can definitely do another midterm. Or, I think I maybe have one or two presidentials left. That's how election officials think about time. And so what is a little bit unclear to me, even having looked through that report, is like how much of this is sort of expected with an aging workforce, that they're just like, I don't have another election, I don't have another presidential left in me. But it is, I think we are seeing a lot of people consider opportunities outside of elections or outside of government, given some of the outside pressures. And it's, hard to begrudge someone that, even if some of the security concerns were not present, it's a grueling work. It's grueling work, right? We're talking about, 20-hour days for weeks at a time, multiple times a year. We've lost the margin for error, right? There used to be room for grace. And we've sort of lost that in a lot of ways. And that's, I think, true not just in elections, but it is particularly acute in elections, where there just isn't the room for a human to make an error. And that's a really difficult work environment to work in. So, we're obviously paying a lot of attention to it at the state level, less so at the local level, because I work for states and territories. But I will say one thing that encourages me is that a lot of the people who are coming into these roles, particularly at the state level, but we're seeing it also at the state level, they're not necessarily brand new to elections. And I think the BPC report emphasizes this as well. So we're not seeing, Joe Smith come in off the street who doesn't know anything about elections. We're typically seeing people who have worked in the office in another capacity come into these leadership roles. And that's actually something to be proud of. I think that we're sort of growing the next generation of election officials. So, at the national level, I focus a lot on making sure that my members have access to this information, so that the people who are newer to the role, or, in the cases where people don't have experience in elections, that they can get up to speed quickly, because this is a year where, there's not a lot of room for figuring it out as you go. I don't know if you want to add anything.
I don't have much to add, because Maryland really hasn't seen that kind of abnormal turnover. I mean, I got old and retired, And same thing in Montgomery County, the election director there, she just didn't have another presidential election in her stomach. So it's been pretty normal attrition in Maryland. And Amy's right, most of the people that have replaced the local election directors have been someone that already worked in either their office or another elections office. So we're sort of maintaining the continuity. But you're right, the slightest mistake is just, oh my God, gets blown out of proportion very quickly.
Hi, Anna Liz Nichols from Michigan Advance. My question comes from my informed experience in Michigan, where we have a woman as our Secretary of State. We have lots of women county clerks and also lots of women in municipality clerks. And so I was wondering if you could, there were several things you said where 20-hour days doesn't say to me that it's a position that is acclimated to women and mothers. Some of the threats that people have faced in my state are very engendered. And so much of what you said about, the perception of election paper pushing sounds very secretarial to me. Not stigma, but perception. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the unique barriers to the job for women in election systems, which women are so entrenched in, but also maybe some of the unique challenges they face in the roles.
So I think I agree, I think, with a lot of the things that you said. There used to be a female chief election official. She was elected, and she said for a long time, people would ask her for the governor's schedule because that's what secretaries do. So
She was Secretary of State.
Yeah. I think listen, I'm a single woman. I don't have kids, so I'm able to sort of navigate that way. But I think that a lot of our members who do have kids do really struggle with a lot of those things. It is not, I think, uniquely women, right? I talk to a lot of my male members who are also like, I'm missing my kids XYZ, my wife is sick, or, it is really difficult. But I think a lot of what you said it resonates and is accurate. And to be, when I was talking about we're not seeing some of these gendered threats, it's not happening at scale. It doesn't mean it's not happening. Certainly, I do have members who have dealt with it, but it's not happening at scale, at least that's being brought to my attention.
Yeah, I had my own personal FBI agent and county cop who assigned to me. So, historically, and still to this day, some of the local people are called clerks, not election directors, as they are now in Maryland. When I took office, they were the clerks. We call them clerks. Yeah, and that's okay. That to me suggests that it's more of a woman's work. And typically at the smaller jurisdictions, they're not just doing elections, they're doing a ton of other things, notaries, corporations. That's another hand. Back there, I think.
Hi, I'm April from the Nevada Current. We have 17 counties in Nevada, 2 of which are big urban ones, which have dedicated register of voters, and then the other 15 are, like you just said, they're clerk or clerk treasurer or clerk recorder, or there's a bunch of different jobs. And we've seen them go in front of our Secretary of State and say, increasingly, especially over the years, this job it is a full-time job, but I have all of these other things, and they've sort of made that case. And they haven't yet gone to the state legislature to be like, these jobs should be a full-time, but I'm wondering if you guys are seeing a push to make, or if you're seeing nationally a push to make rural county election officials dedicated jobs. Are we seeing a move towards realizing that this job is not something you can also be the county recorder and do the notaries and do all of the other things? Is that a movement that's happening beyond our urban centers?
Well, Amy addressed the whether or not there's a movement, but it's very difficult unless you're in some position of power to get money, to get people focused on elections and get money dedicated to it. As I said earlier, I was lucky because I had the backing of the person that appointed me, which was the governor originally, and the general leadership of the General Assembly. That's fading away, but not because I left, of course not.
So we're not really seeing a movement, but every time I talk to local election officials, that is what I hear. And, you know, even so often in the jurisdictions where the local chief election official, so like Clark County, is elected, they often have more responsibilities than just elections, and they often have like someone in their office who just does elections. Not always, but often. But there are a lot of jurisdictions, you know, I think a lot about, you know, in Massachusetts, for example, the local election officials do elections, they do taxes, they do deeds, they do death, they do dog licenses, you know, like they do marriage licenses, even LA County, which is the largest election jurisdiction in the country, that local election official handles elections for the largest election jurisdiction in the country, but also marriage licenses. Because imagine all of our surprise when we saw him on stage at the Grammys, you know, because they did a mass wedding at the Grammys a couple of years ago, and we were all like, oh, hey, we know that guy. You know, so it is just sort of a function of the way local government is set up. It would not, you know, I think there are a lot of people who would maybe design local government differently now if we were redoing it, but we're not. And so for now, at least, we're sort of stuck with what we got. One thing, you know, that Linda said, that it's really hard to get money for elections. One of the things we've heard, you know, long before the critical infrastructure designation is, you know, when you're going to your legislature, you're going to your county board or whatever for your appropriation, it's really easy to be like, I need money because I need a new fire station, or I need a new gazebo, and we can put your name on it and whatever. No one's putting their name on a voter registration system, right? No one's putting their name on voting equipment, you know, the like Linda Lamone honorary whatever. That's not happening. But, you know, like, so that's like part of the challenge also, is that like the concept of elections is a little bit more nebulous than a lot of the other competing funding priorities. And it should be noted that local government across the board struggles with funding. It's just, you know, we work in elections, and elections are a pretty high profile
Rarely, though. Yeah.
situation.
One of the things
for us.
that happened in Maryland was back in the 1960s when everything was controlled locally, like in a lot of jurisdictions. They created the State Board of Elections, and the General Assembly mandated by law that the counties had to fund them. And that has evolved since everything was centralized in the late 1990s. That the counties have to share in the cost of everything. So when I bought a new voting system, which if you all go back to 2002 and read the articles about the plight of my touchscreen voting system for the state of Maryland, the counties had to pay for half of it. And they weren't happy, but they had to pay, because I'd spend the money and then the state would build the counties. That is a rare exception. That's very rare.
Yeah, and, oh, I lost it.
Okay.
That's fine.
Hi, my name's Emily Anderson Stern. I'm a reporter at the Salt Lake Tribune in Utah. In Utah, our chief elections official is the lieutenant governor. And about a year ago, the legislature defunded her security detail as they increased funding for the governors. And this is a year after January 6th. So I'm curious kind of how you're seeing, as they're increasing threats toward elections officials, how you're seeing states, especially states where there have been problems about conspiracies around elections, how they're responding as far as with security responses, et cetera.
Well, yesterday or the day before, one of the presidential candidates came out against the election director in Wisconsin, and they've now increased her security proactively, which is just horrifying to think about.
So one of the things that my members, and I can only speak sort of about my members, struggle with is that none of them are elected. So in general, what we saw in 2020 and early 2021, and if you haven't read about Enemies of the People, which was a website set up by Iran to target election officials, federal government officials, some local government, I mean, it was like really, and it had their photos of their homes and their home addresses and targets over their homes and email addresses, all that other stuff. So when this was going on, we got a real crash course in how a lot of this works. And so one of the things we struggle with is that none of our members are elected. And so there is this idea that, like, you know, cabinet level officials should have access to security, not consistently, but that is something common. So we struggle with that more, which is that a lot of our members really, really struggle to access security resources. I'm familiar, the lieutenant governor is not the only chief election official who has had their detail taken away. I don't understand some of those decisions because personally, you know, an attack on government is an attack on government regardless of who that person is. But, you know, in some ways we have made some progress because, like I said, in early 2021 when this was going on, I mean, we were just like, who do we talk to? I mean, I have a member who spent, you know, hours on the phone with her local police department because she was not a chief election official, was not elected, and begging for help because she was scared, and the best she could get was they conceded to drive by her house like once per day. You know, we've made some progress since then where I think state police and state law enforcement are more engaged with election officials. They're certainly more familiar with what's going on. For a lot of them, this sort of came out of left field. Frankly, for a lot of us, it came out of left field also. But if I've learned anything in the last couple of years, it's that basically the only field that is more decentralized than elections is law enforcement. And so that can be really difficult as well because there's state law enforcement, county law enforcement, city law enforcement, and there's sheriffs. And I mean, it's a real who's who of local government, but it can be really difficult for people to navigate that. And if you're going through something that is really scary at that moment, it
paralyzes you.
Yeah, it can be really, really difficult to sort of navigate that while also, you know, trying to be a human being and do your job. It can be really, really, really difficult.
I had to take my name off my mailbox at my house. I had to get a new mailbox. That was just one minor thing that they recommended. And I live way back off the road, and the cops said, well, we'll drive by, and they came by and they said, we can't see your house, so we can't help you.
Hi, I'm Danielle Battaglia. I'm with McClatchy, DC, and I cover North Carolina, where a lot of these election conspiracies are coming out of. And one thing we've been told is that the more reporting that is taking place on threats to poll workers, the more those threats are increasing. So we've been advised not to report on them, but I do think that it's important to tell these stories so people understand what's going on. And I'm trying to figure out if that's still what you guys, I know it didn't come from you, but still what is believed that it's causing more issues if we report on it, and then how we can go about telling these stories in a way that protects the poll worker but still tells those stories.
Interesting.
So I have a lot of thoughts on this. First of all, if you can find that line, like, please let me know, because we are always trying to navigate it, because it is really difficult, right? You want to tell the story. We want people to know this is happening, because I think all Americans should be concerned that this is happening to government officials. And I should also say, we're not the only government officials dealing with this. We're just the ones that people are paying the most attention to. But all Americans should be concerned that this is happening to government officials. And so it is really a really delicate balance, and I just don't have a good answer for you, unfortunately. We have seen it go poorly, and so I think that's also what is so scary for people. So there was reporting a couple of years ago about a threat actually out of Nevada, where the person who reported the threat was named in the article, and the person who made the threat was also named in the article, and he didn't care to be named in that article, and he threatened her more. And so in some ways, the problem is that stories like that we sort of latch onto, but there has to be a happy medium about how to do it, because I think it is so important that we are getting these stories out there. I think, one other thing, though, is to remember, there's poll workers, and then there's local election officials, and then there's state, there's a lot of different levels. And so I think one of the hesitations, particularly about poll workers, is not that it isn't happening and not that it isn't horrible, because these people that's not their job. They're really just sort of stepping up to help their community. Is people are already resistant to being poll workers, and so that is also a fine line where it's like, we don't want to overemphasize the bad things that are happening and make our pool of people willing to participate in this exceptionally important duty smaller. And so it is just really, really hard. But I will say, remembering that when you're talking to people about threats, you're talking to people, and it's happening to humans, and it's their real lives. Especially in early 2021, and for most of 2021, this was something that drove me crazy, is that I would get, calls or emails. Can you connect me to someone who's experienced death threats? We're not computers. Reporting on a cyber intrusion or a cyber incident, or, even if you're acting in your professional capacity and you make a mistake, that's different. But when we're talking about people's lives, and when the pandemic was raging and kids were still home from school, we're talking about truly their families. And so I think the thing I always remind reporters is, just keep in mind that you're asking people to relive a traumatic event. And a lot of our members don't want to talk about it. It's not because it's not happening to us. Our chief election officials don't want to talk about it. Our election directors don't want to talk about it. I don't want to talk about it. It's you're asking us to relive something really traumatic, and so just approaching that with sensitivity is the best I think we can hope for.
Hi, I'm Nancy. I'm with Rhode Island Current. I used to work in Maryland 6 years ago. So my question is a two-parter, and I'll try to get this succinctly out. In the last 8 months in Rhode Island, I've covered a presidential preference primary, a special congressional election, and a political party ballot petition, all of which have had scandals with dead people signing ballot nomination forms. And in the 10 years that I've reported on elections, I've never covered or written about dead people, signature fraud before. So I guess I'm wondering, first, are you seeing that happen more or being detected more? And is that a symptom of kind of increased scrutiny around election security and fraud, or is it actually happening more than it used to? And then the second part of that is how to write as a journalist, how to cover, particularly in the process before there are official investigations opened, charges filed, but when we have a process where our local boards of canvassers, we don't have counties in Rhode Island, our local boards of canvassers can flag to the state suspicious looking signatures, confirmed we know these are dead people whose names are on because it's Rhode Island and we know everyone in this 1,000 person town. How to write about that without sort of perpetuating misperceptions about election security.
Well, have all those that you heard about been verified? Because what happens generally, Kevin Jr. and Kevin Sr., Kevin Jr. goes to the poll worker marks him off in the poll book as Kevin Sr., who is now deceased, and that's reported as a, quote, dead person voting. Because we do audits on that stuff in Maryland, and most of it turns out to not be true. I don't know about Rhode
In
Island.
these cases, the local boards were not verifying the signatures, but it was, so they weren't counting toward that person's signatures to get ballot access, but if there was enough of them, it was being flagged as, is there fraud, is there a criminal component? And in the case from our special congressional primary in September of last year, they just filed criminal charges against a consultant that the candidate hired last week, and the investigation is ongoing. So it's not that those signatures are being used toward that person or that party's ability to get ballot access, but it's like, is there something sinister going on with the ballot, with the signature gathering, where they're just writing down, random people's names or writing down names. There was also people who said they didn't sign it, which is like a little bit more of a gray area.
First of all, I just spoke at something in September with Stephanie Machado from Rhode Island, and this topic came up. So I think there's a lot more scrutiny happening now, public scrutiny happening on every part of the election process. And we've seen efforts from election officials to make things more transparent. So things like live streaming stuff, or scanning and posting on a website, or things like that. So it's not, I don't want to comment on the frequency, but I do think some of it is because these people are paying more attention to these processes and realizing, oh, people don't just show up on the ballot. Like, there's a process to get there, and if I'm concerned about the person who is on the ballot, maybe I should be concerned about how they got there in the first place. So I think that is part of it. I think in terms of how to report on it, it's very difficult, and I really appreciate the sort of the precision of the language that you used, because that's really, really important, is being specific about what part of the process that you're talking about. So when you're talking about petition signatures, that's not the same as a signature on an e-poll book. That's not the same as voter fraud. That's, signature, that's an issue with the signatures. And so I think, elections are a paper-driven process, even as we have moved a lot of it to different kinds of electronic means. But, being really precise with that terminology, because we're going to see issues like that come up, and they've happened everywhere for a long time. It's just that we're sort of paying more attention to it now. And I think there's a way to think about it, and bear with me for a second, there's a way to think about it like a success story, right? These are checks and balances that are built into our election system to make sure that what is happening, that the candidates that voters get to vote on are, there appropriately. And so I'm not an optimistic person by nature, but I do try to think about some of these stories where we're finding issues is like, this is a success, right? Maybe, we might wish we caught it at a different point or a different time, but ultimately, this is how the process is supposed to work. There are checks and balances built in, and we have to, I think, sort of take that with a level of gratitude, because otherwise we wouldn't know it was there at all. That was the most optimistic thing I've ever said.
Hi, my name is Samia. I'm from Cal Matters in California. I'm curious, I know you said you don't take positions, but I was looking into ERIC, the database that would work between states, and I'm just curious, I know there's been sort of conspiracy theories about it being a bad thing, and I'm wondering if, like, in reporting on it, is there anything that I should know, I guess, or...
Well, I'm sitting next to one of the founding members of ERIC, so I'm going to let Linda take this one.
Excellent.
There's absolutely nothing to those rumors, absolutely nothing. The initial states that joined ERIC were red, white, and blue. And it's a very valuable tool. It probably is never going to be replicated because of the amount of money it would take to do it. It was, who was it at Pew? David Becker was the person at Pew who's still around, but he was the one that really convinced us all that this was a good idea and convinced Pew to fund it. And then I think IBM, I've forgotten the guy's name, gave a computer programmer to the project, I think basically for free. And it really helped us keep our voter registration rolls. And with all the Republican states dropping out, it's their loss, frankly. But no, John Spiros did not fund it, had nothing to do with it. I was the first one to sign the agreement. Very proud of it, and Maryland's still participating. So it's a very good project. I'm not biased.
Just to follow up to that,
Yeah.
you know, as more and more states withdraw, how do you think that will impact the trajectory of some of these conspiracies as it makes it harder for elections officials to verify voter rolls?
Yeah, I don't know whether this still exists or not, but years ago when I first started looking into this, if I reside, I'm a registered voter in Maryland, and I go to Salt Lake and die, it depends on your state's laws as to whether or not my death can be reported back to Maryland. And I think that still exists in some jurisdictions. So ERIC was a really good way to overcome that, because we routinely exchange death records with the database and however it's hashed and all that stuff. My personal opinion, which is just merely that, is it's a real shame, and that it's going to hurt the ability to move forward and make it even more robust.
Hi, Lucia Starberg with KUNR, also in Nevada. Earlier we talked about like election workers not having another presidential election in them, but it feels like coming out of Nevada, like there are a lot of county clerks leaving. In Washoe County, we're on our third registrar of voters since the 2020 election. I guess our turnover, like our stories about election workers leaving helpful, and like what would you want to see instead? Like, of course, getting out reliable information about the election process is very important, but I guess what kind of coverage would you like to see?
No, it is a good point, right? Like, while there is an expected amount of turnover, we're obviously, I think the data support that we're seeing more than that, particularly at the local level, and certainly in more states, in some states, more than expected. I think, I think it is important that people know that when a new election official comes in at the state level or at the local level, they're not just like being plunked on Mars, right? It's overwhelming and they have a lot to learn, but they're not just like...
I was.
Well, that was...
Well, the governor said she knows something about elections. She was counsel to the state board. Let her do it.
Most states have really beefed up their training of local election officials. I know there's been development of certification programs and things like that, and there have been really robust efforts within states to sort of build communities, right, so that people don't feel isolated. And that is what I see as a big part of my role at the national level. Like, you might be new to this role, you might be new to elections, but you're not doing this alone. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so I think it's really important to report on turnover, and certainly it is happening. But I think it is also important to acknowledge at least the sort of framework that is in place to help and support these people. I think we've seen that really effectively done in Colorado, where the Colorado County Clerks Association is really, it's a really robust association. They have a really good sort of network of supporting each other, and calling out inappropriate behavior, even when it's among their own members. So that, I think, is the way to focus on it, so that you're still reporting on it, but it's not gloom and doom. It's not, human lands on Mars. It's, they have a network around them. They have access to resources to support them, so that voters aren't sort of feeling like they're being hung out to dry.
And I think a lot of the stories I've seen recently have done just that. Linda Lamone's leaving, but so-and-so's taking her place, and he or she has 10 years of experience and been on staff for whatever. There have been positive transition articles, which I liked. I thought was good.
Hi, Ariel Malong from Amsterdam News in New York. I was curious what you guys thought about the uncommitted, blank ballot campaign and your outlook towards younger voters.
What do you mean by uncommitted? People that are not registered?
People who didn't vote in they voted, but they didn't mark their ballots for the presidential campaign, or for Biden in the presidential campaign. Yeah.
Well, I have no comment on that, just to say that is an option within state law to do, and certainly varies by state. But I think, election officials really value the role of young voters because young voters become old voters, right? Once you do it once, it's habit forming. And so bringing people into the process early is something that most election officials feel really pretty strongly about. And so I hope that young voters start to sort of feel that, right? They want to be a part of the process, but also, selfishly, I run a membership association. So I want people to vote and think, oh, I either liked doing that or I would love to learn more about it. Maybe next time I'll be a poll worker. Maybe I'll get involved with my local election office. Maybe I'll be a state election official. And so to me, that's also sort of how we grow the future of our community, and so that our community, the election community, looks like America also, is that people have to start getting involved. And I think voting is a fairly low barrier to entry for most people to experience democracy and get sort of bitten by this weird thing that we do professionally.
And there are programs in several states that are actively reaching out to the young voters to get involved, not only voting, but to be poll workers. There's a lot of that going on. If they want to be poll workers, then maybe they'll vote too.
I had a question about poll workers too. I'm Shaylee Rager. I'm with Montana Public Radio, so I'm from a pretty rural state, and I know poll worker shortages are something a lot of people are thinking about. I'm wondering if you guys have any examples of creative ways administrators are trying to solve that, and what you see as how that might work out.
Raise their pay. Seriously. That they've done that in Maryland, and it's been very successful. Repeat judges get paid more than first-time we call them judges. Judges, and the General Assembly has mandated a higher rate of pay for them. It's pretty low. I mean, they're working 16-hour days for $100, in Maryland, we've got the governor and a lot of the local jurisdictions to give their employees administrative leave, so they still get paid as in their jobs and as poll workers. That's another idea that's worked very well. We've got a lot of state employees.
So administrative leave for the state employees.
And county employees too. Yeah.
So this was something we talked about a lot in 2020, especially because the average age of poll workers is someone who was more susceptible to COVID. And so there was a lot of concern about this. And so we saw a lot of really creative ideas come out in 2020 that states have stuck with. So in Ohio, before the pandemic, they were already working with their state bar association to get CLE credit, continuing legal education credit for their poll workers. And they really talked this up truly before the pandemic. At our last conference before the pandemic, everyone was like, oh, that's really interesting. And then the world ended and everyone was like, tell us more about that. And so we've really seen that idea take off. So they still have I think they call them Lawyers for Liberty in Ohio. And Alabama just also sort of officially deployed that program. My organization and our colleagues at the National Association of Secretaries of State have worked with the American Bar Association to reach out to that community to encourage them to serve as election workers. And we have seen on a sort of case-by-case basis state bar associations in a sort of less coordinated way, but state bar associations offer CLE credit for serving as a poll worker. We also saw in 2020 states work with their associations of realtors and other sort of associations of accountants, I think also, right? Because when you're in those positions as a realtor or as an accountant, you have ties to your community, and so it's a good way for them to sort of be out there and be seen. So you're sort of playing on people's business interests and their interest in serving the community. And some of those programs, again, have continued. Nebraska is actually a really interesting example where they have their state law allows poll workers to be drafted.
Come here, work for me.
Yeah. So that was on the books before 2020, and I don't remember how much they really leaned on it in 2020, but they are very proud of the fact that if it really hit the fan, they could draft poll workers. And what we have seen also since 2020 is that a lot of state election offices have sort of developed sort of like a tiger team, where you have like a pool of either election office employees or other state agency employees who, if on election day or during early voting there is a shortage at a particular location, you can sort of send that person or send a team out so that those are covered. But it is a constant challenge. It's something that people are paying a lot more attention to since 2020. But I think Linda can attest, this has been a problem forever. If it's Tuesday, it's election day, and that means that we need people to show up and work on election day. And it's hard work, and it's time consuming, and people have jobs, and so that can be a real challenge. We've also seen some of the language communities get a little bit more involved also, to make sure that there are native language speakers at voting locations, because the idea is that if you have a good experience when you vote the first time, you'll come back and you'll do it again. So it is an ongoing challenge. I think a lot of us appreciate the sort of continued focus on it, but we're also sort of like, well, where were you guys 10 years ago when we were also struggling with this?
One of the things that some jurisdictions tried, which had sort of a funny ending, is they work from 6 in the morning until 10 at night. Well, let's do shifts. So we'll have Amy come in and do the morning shift, and Linda comes in to supposedly do the afternoon shift. Well, what happens when Linda doesn't show? So the only way shift worked was when it was like a husband and wife, because the second one would definitely show up. So there have been a lot of kind of interesting experiments to help solve the problem.
Yeah,
we gave the chief election judges in Maryland the authority to go out on the street and haul people in to serve as election judges. And they haven't done it a whole lot, but they had that authority.
Yeah, there are a couple of states that do shifts, but that's exactly why, right? You need sort of twice as many people.
Yeah.
Well, I promised Amy and Linda this would just be an hour, and I want to hold myself to that, and you, I guess. But
well,
I wanted to.
Plus, they get a break, so that you don't want to.
Well, maybe we'll do some shifts. But I want to thank them for a very instructional discussion and for the time and energy. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.